president of the Young Americans for Freedom chapter here at Radford University. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, conservative organization that works to help promote individual freedom, limited government, free enterprise, traditional values, and a strong national defense. If you're interested in joining our chapter or want to know more about what we do on campus, you can visit our DAF table outside after the speech. Our key to campus engagement is bringing the most popular speakers in the conservative movement to campus. Tonight, we are excited and honored to host our first speaker, Dr. Derryck Green. Derryck Green is a political commentator, writer, and member of several conservative organizations. A member of Project 21, a leadership network of Black conservatives, and a contributor to the National Center for Public Policy Research, Derryck provides analysis on economic policy, the intersection between culture and race, pro-life issues including abortion and capital punishment, religion, immigration policy, and politics in general. As a political commentator and writer, his work has been featured and cited in a number of media outlets, including townhall.com, spectator.org, nearorthodoxy.com, theamericanconservative.com, American Urban Radio Networks, and several other media outlets across the country. Recently, during an interview conducted by CQ researcher for an in-depth report about racial conflict affecting the country, Derryck accepted an invitation to share his thoughts in an opinion piece regarding Black Lives Matter, in which he argued against the validity, credibility, and agenda of the Black activist organization. As faculty at Radford University, he wrote and appeared in a video entitled, "Who Are the Racists, Conservatives or Liberals?" where he debunked the myth of conservative racism. The video has been seen almost 2 million times across various social media outlets. He's currently written 2 more courses at Radford University that he hopes to film before the end of the year. Derryck is also a staff writer for the Institute on Religion and Democracy, a faith-based organization that follows and comments on current political and religious issues affecting Christianity, culture, and politics. Derryck received his doctorate in theology and ministry in May, and his dissertation will be published later this year. He is also working on a second manuscript where he argues in favor of the social, moral, and cultural benefits of Blacks rejecting a collective, hyphenated racial identity and embracing racial neutrality and full social integration to become fully American. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Derryck Green.
So I want to thank the Young Americans for Freedom for the invitation to come and address you this evening. I also want to thank Radford University as well for giving me an opportunity to kind of share my opinions and my thoughts about the racial dialogue in the country. Some of what I'm going to say is a bit uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for me to say. It's been uncomfortable for me to write. But it's not intentionally provocative to put people off. I want people to kind of rethink how we see race in America today. But before I begin, again, my name is Derryck Green, and I am with Project 21. I want to give you guys a little bit about this so you can kind of get the framework of where some of my comments are coming from. I make no apologies about the fact that I am conservative, but I am also a Christian, so there's going to be a lot of religious references in this piece, primarily because I'm dealing with race. And when it comes to race and religion, Blacks are the most religious demographic in the country. And there's a heritage that shows that, and I will demonstrate that this evening, that the heritage of religion in Black communities was the source of strength in faith when Blacks were enslaved, during segregation, and obviously most notably during the Civil Rights Movement. It was the Black churches, it was the onus of that religiosity that gave life to that movement. And it's been de-religionized, I guess if you could say. A lot of times when we refer to Martin Luther King, we refer to him as what? Dr. King. But he was a reverend long before he was a doctor, and it was because of his religiosity that motivated and gave the strength for the Civil Rights Movement. And so that's what's going to be in here. A lot of you may think, after listening to what I'm going to say, that I hold blacks in very low self-esteem. And I hope that it is very, very obvious that I give blacks much more credit than we give ourselves, and I give blacks more credit than other people give us. And that's what I'm trying to convey in this piece, is that there's there's a history of black empowerment in our country amongst blacks, but I think that it has been hijacked, and it's no longer empowering. It is convinced several generations of blacks to depend on other people for our well-being, rather than us dictating our own fate. So real quickly, I am the son of two parents who were born in the Jim Crow South, Mississippi and Texas. So during the course of my remarks, if you think that I don't understand racism, believe me, I do. We travel back and forth every year to Mississippi. No offense to anybody in Mississippi, I don't like it. It's really not a good place. There's some stuff that is carried over. But in the grand scheme of things, so what? There may be racists still in Mississippi, there will be racists in Virginia, but so what? I hope to convey before the night is over that even though racism exists, and it will always exist on this side of heaven, it is not the social determinant as it once was for us. And so my parents raised me. They were both registered Democrats. They both served in the military. They were Christian, they were religious, and they raised me unintentionally to be more conservative than not. So I was once a Democrat. I saw the light, so to speak, after kind of talking to my parents and listening to what they had to say, and flat out calling them out on the fact that they raised me differently than what they articulated in public. What they articulated in public was what I call the black stance. You're supposed to think, believe, feel, and act a particular way when it comes to politics. However, inside the home, things were a lot different. They wouldn't let me listen to the kind of music that I wanted to listen to, and probably rightfully so. They didn't let me dress the way I wanted to. They didn't let me wear my hair the way I wanted to. Every time I said I'm thinking or I'm going, I would be stopped by both my parents and say, "Don't you let those G's fall off of your language." So I had to say thinking. I couldn't say for. I mean, there's a lot of things that my parents did. And finally, I got old enough and I started thinking about how we voted and what they said about conservatives and what they said about Republicans, but then how they raised me. And I said that this is very interesting because you're raising me in a particular way that reflects the people that you're demonizing. Now we have to talk this out a little bit. And so eventually what it came down to was that my mom is no longer a Democrat. She's like me, she's an registered independent. And my father, he was he was a Democrat. He passed away 5 years ago in June, but he was a Democrat. And so for people like my parents, even though I did not vote for President Barack Obama, I thought for my parents' generation, it was good that he got elected. Because they grew up under Jim Crow. And to go from Jim Crow to a black president in 40 to 50 years is astounding by every measure imaginable. So just keep that in mind when I give these remarks. I do not think that racism does not exist. I do not hate black people. I am trying to encourage black people to embrace the type of self-determination that has been so evident in our history. What I'm going to say is part of the second manuscript that I have almost completed, and it is making the case for blacks to finish the job of integration. So also that you'll hear that as well. So to begin, the most obvious and inarguable source of black innocence is the victimization that blacks endured for centuries at the hands of a race that insisted on black inferiority. Like all victims, what blacks lost in power, they gained in innocence. An innocence that in turn entitled them to pursue power. This was the innocence that fueled the civil rights movement of the 60s, and that gave blacks their first real power in American life. Victimization metamorphosed into power via innocence. But this formula carries a drawback that I believe is virtually as devastating to blacks today as victimization once was. It is a formula that binds the victim to his victimization, to his status as a victim, And this, I'm convinced, is the tragedy of black power in America today. It is primarily a victim's power, grounded too deeply in the entitlement derived from past injustice and in the innocence that Western Christian tradition has always associated with poverty. Whatever gains this power brings in the short run through political action, it undermines in the long run. Social victims may be collectively entitled, but they are all too often individually demoralized. Since the social victim has been oppressed by society, he comes to feel that his individual life will be improved more by changes in society, and here by government coercion and mandate, than by his own initiative. Without realizing it, he makes society, again through the force of government intervention, rather than himself the agent of change. The power he finds in his victimization may lead him to collective action against the society, but it also encourages passivity within his sphere of his personal life. Now that quote is by Shelby Steele in what I think is one of his greatest books, The Content of Our Character. He expresses what I see as the truth regarding black identity or being black in America in the post-civil rights era. It's an innocence born of historical victimization that's been calcified and continually reinforced since the late 1960s. This period has been defined by black consciousness and the identity politics of the left. Today, being black in America means emphasizing the dependence on or proximity to racial victimization. It's preserved by the kind of racial paranoia that interprets racial slights, what we see as microaggressions, and the lack of socioeconomic equality of outcome as confirmation of the ongoing presence of systemic racism. Now again, I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist. I think it does exist, and I think that there's an argument to be made that systemic racism exists, just not the way it's commonly defined and interpreted. And if you want me to go into that later, I will. This mentality and habit of maximizing racial grievance gained traction when the civil rights movement ended, and a more combative movement that emphasized black race pride and identity demanded social and economic access, which presupposed equality of outcome. As an aside, Black Lives Matter is thoroughly at the center of this vein of racialized political agitation, antagonization, and social action. Now, we'll stop here. I've written a few pieces on why I don't believe that Black Lives Matter is a continuation of the civil rights movement. I don't think that it takes a lot to see the differences in nonviolent direct action and going up and shouting at people and inconveniencing the very people you want to be hearers and doers of your message. In my opinion, and what I think is obvious, is the result of defining itself collectively as a group of racial victims, American blacks continue to suffer from racial insecurity and emotional crisis in this new world of multicultural and multi-ethnic integration and freedom. Repeatedly redefining what it means to be black in America as a service to self-esteem, a process I've labeled the black identity crisis, stems directly from this racial self-doubt and racial anxiety that generally accompanies a lack of self-determination and earned achievement. This black identity crisis is defined as being dependent upon one's racial makeup and characteristics, consisting of ideological preferences and demands, political support and behavior, the historical association with anti-black oppression, and resulting grievances. It's further defined by the demand that people, groups, and institutions, in other words, society, treat blacks separately and distinctly, granting blacks special privileges that, when examined, are usually consistent with lower standards and expectations, rather than wanting to be judged on the universal measures of character and merit-based achievement. In my opinion, this desire for special treatment is partially the result of we as blacks not having fully embraced and consummated the civil rights movement's initiative to racially integrate into American society, achieving a sense of belonging and accomplishment on our own terms. Many blacks still maintain an in this country but not of this country mentality when it comes to living in America. We enjoy the advantages of being in America and American when it's convenient for us, but we refuse to fully commit to the American experiment, which includes completely embracing an American identity. To do so means sacrificing the very thing that we hold most dear, a semblance of power based on a hyper-racialized identity of racial victimization that exploits white guilt. Blacks, particularly in the middle class, want the social comfort and convenience and security that comes with being American without having to fulfill the requirements of integration that the civil rights movement began, thus becoming American. Unfortunately, this identity crisis preserves the unexamined feelings of racial anxiety, resentment, inferiority, and hostility. This part American but perpetually angry and eternally oppressed community-wide attitude has severely hindered Black development and compromises racial and ethnic reconciliation, both in the Christian church in America, but also in our culture at large. Additionally, it thwarts the advancement and full achievement of Black well-being by our own hands, by requiring racial and ideological group conformity and allegiance before all else, sacrificing our individuality and our American identity. This racialized oppositional posture is balanced and facilitated by white passivity, restraint, shame, submission, and ultimately capitulation. As a result of the social and political transition to racialized Black politics in the late 60s, Blacks lost the moral authority of race neutrality toward integration that defined the movement for civil rights. Instead, Blacks embraced being victims of oppression as its essential characteristic. This defined as being the embodiment of white victimization, both historically and perpetually on into the future. Reverend King and the civil rights movement he's identified with appealed to the unremitting moral logic that emphasized Christian character, such as self-discipline, self-restraint, obligation to societal decency, mutual respect, rather than emphasizing or being defined by color or vengeance, a perspective that was successful in highlighting and ultimately defeating the moral hypocrisy and racial double standard of segregation. Christian nonviolence and restraint in the face of physical violence demonstrated dignity and persistence in pursuit of actualized equality. These virtues compelled the nation to make good on its claims of God-given rights, democracy, freedom, and liberty, extending to Blacks the ideals beautifully articulated in the Declaration of Independence and subsequently enumerated in the Constitution of the United States. This new racial protocol of Black power or hyper-racialized Black politics of the left, however, reversed this equation. Radical Black identity politics required that Blacks be judged away. And my parents come from a broken home. My mom has like 9 or 10 brothers and sisters. Dad was a Rolling Stone. My father, same way. My mother grew up in poverty in Mississippi was different than poverty in Texas. There's some overlap, which is different. She was a straight A student. My dad was a straight A student. It just blew my mind at what people are able to accomplish, even though they're poor. And they wanted to inculcate in me what was inculcated in them. We may live in a broke down shack, we may not have any running water, and our bathroom is outside. But just because we're poor doesn't mean we're any less human than these people over here. We're just as human, and they carry themselves that way. Even though they had people yelling in their face, saying that they were subhuman, they conducted themselves with the dignity that I think a lot of us have forgotten. And so we should be quick to say just because they don't have a lot of money that they're incapable of acting a particular way. A lot of people will argue that moral poverty leads to economic poverty, and I think there's a case for that. But just keep in mind that these are the things that I think can be fully embraced once we as Black Americans embrace the idea that this is our home. We don't know any other place. It hasn't been perfect. But if you take slavery, if you take segregation, combine them together, and we can say from the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64, technically we've had 55 years of freedom. Look what Blacks have been able to accomplish in 55 little years, trying at 60%. Imagine if we put in as much as our ethnic counterparts really would be. So with that, I'll conclude, and if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Thank you.
So give it up one more time for Derryck Green. Everyone's set up here for a Q&A session. You can line up for any questions you have. If you disagree with the speaker,
Hi, my name is Nicole. I'm a Michael.
Michael.
Yeah. I'm an MSW student, and I just found it rather interesting, your definition of white privilege. You noted in your speech that it was basically expressing the evils and the wrongdoings of white people when that's not what we consider it at all. We're just simply asking white people in general to notice that they have privilege in America, and we're asking them to be aware of that when thinking about things that black people go through in America. So that's all I have to say. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I appreciate it. I didn't really define white privilege, I just said blaming white privilege. I try not to define it because every time I hear it, there's a different definition. And so if you could help me out to explain what racial privilege exists for whites that does not exist for blacks.
It's the simple fact that every day I wake up and I think about the fact that I'm a black woman in America. I don't know if
That's a privilege, by the way. That's a privilege. Being a black woman in America.
But there's negatives to that side of that as well.
Oh, sure. There's going to be negatives to everything.
But
No, I'm saying, I'm just challenging you. I just want to hear what the laid out definition is, so we at least are on the same page.
So it's not a privilege to go to the store and not have anything work for my complexion, my hair, my basic human needs. So that's a white privilege. I'm not able to do those things, especially in an area such as this in most places across the country, unless you're in an urban area. That's a privilege reserved for the standard normal, which is white. So that's white privilege.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, but that also could be the effect of the market. I went to school in Nebraska. 5 black people in my entire school. The local Walmart didn't have any black products at all. Because the market there is predominantly white, they cater to that market. So it's not necessarily privilege based, and what I think I understand what you're saying. It's just it's a reflection of the market in that particular area. But if you go to a place like, Jackson, there's going to be a lot of black products in that particular area because it's a reflection of the market and the people who live there.
Okay, but I'm from PG County, Maryland, like I'm assuming what you're talking about, and there's still products for white people in more abundance, even though there's more black people.
Okay.
So I get what you're saying, and like it could be the market, but it's also like, well, why isn't there less products for white people if I have this so-called black privilege in PG County, Maryland?
Okay. Well taken. I would have to look at some more variables to see if that's a privilege-based argument or if there's something else in play that contributes to that.
I'm also an MSW student, and my question is, how would your views of systematic racism explain the killings of unarmed black men and women?
So are you, let me, just clarification, are you saying unarmed blacks being killed is a product of systemic racism?
Yes.
Okay. I would disagree with the premise because there's over 42 million black people in America, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think I have the stats here from last year. In 2018, according to the Washington Post, 998 people were shot and killed by police. 456 were white, 229 were black. Of that 229, only 18 were unarmed. So if we take 18 people shot by the police against 42 million blacks, that's not systemic racism by any stretch of the imagination.
I have a question for that. Do you know how many were unarmed that were white?
I didn't take the ones, but you go to the Washington Post and see the same thing. But again, 18 unarmed blacks against 42 million people, that's not systemic racism, is it?
I think it is, but
That's a very, very broad, not only is that a broad definition of systemic racism, that also ignores the fact that some of these unarmed blacks were killed by a black policeman. So, is it systemically racist for a black to kill a black? And if it is, then your outrage should be more on black violence and criminality than it is with this particular issue here. If you're defining systemic racism that broadly.
I have a second question. What would your idea of black immigration look like?
So for example, focusing more on the benefits and privileges that we have rather than what setbacks we have. One, I don't know how many external setbacks we have in the country because, as I said before, everything is been linked with racism. So what I would like immigration to be is to say, yes, America is spotted with wars. yet we embrace this country. Now we're going to take advantage of all the opportunities in this country. We're not running from the fact that we were brought here as slaves. We're not going to label ourselves African American. I can tell by the color of your skin that you descended from people in Africa. You can tell the same about me. So calling us African American isn't going to tell us anything else that we don't already know. We should be American blacks. American first, black second. It doesn't minimize our blackness, but it emphasizes our Americanness. Integrating and taking all of the opportunities that are responsible and not trying to demonize white people or white America or mainstream America every time we get it. That's primarily what I just explained to you, generally done by people who are black and in the middle class. Poor black people don't have time for all that. I'm not saying that they don't have those grievances. They do. I've talked to them and I've experienced it. You sat down and worked regularly. I get it. But the people who seem the most resistant to integrating into America fully have been blacks who are in the middle class. And I have a theory why that is, but part of the idea of integration is saying we're not going to sit there and discuss various definitions of white privilege when we can't find one that's an umbrella term. Let's go and do what we are here to do. Let's do what our ancestors could not do and dream of having an opportunity to do. And I just don't think that we're doing that as well as we otherwise could.
Thank you.
I'm a student, and during your talk, I found it interesting that you stated you wanted to take out, like, basically, I guess, like, terming, like, black or African American, but yet use terms like black on black crime, which I find can be dangerous, as in...
Oh, black on black crime is dangerous.
But why is it not when another white person kills another white person, why is that not referred to as white on white crime or held to the same standard? So if we're taking out the idea of taking like color out of things, why do you still use the term black on black crime?
It's the easiest descriptor for this type of information. When you're talking about blacks killing other blacks, how else would we describe that?
Okay, so why, but my question is, like, why are we not describing or bringing attention to white on white crime?
I think when we do, one, because it's deflection. It relativizes and trivializes the problem at hand. Oh, well, you know, white people are killing white people too. Good. How does that save the lives of the blacks that are being killed by other blacks? That's a deflection. If people want to worry about white on white crime, that's great, they'll do it. But as I said before, 2% of the population is responsible for 54% of the violent crime in the country. That's a problem. Especially when we're only 12% of the entire population, I think the focus should be where the problem is at. We can worry about white people killing white people in a minute. I want to save black lives.
So what would you say is the issue behind black people killing other black people? What would you say?
No fathers.
No fathers.
As I said before, statistically weeded out, those people who are more likely to be involved in gangs, to use drugs and alcohol, to be in the criminal justice system, are more likely to come from homes without fathers than those who come from homes with fathers. If we want to address that problem, we need to start talking about having black men back in the homes with their wives and children.
Okay. My name is David.
To the doctor's point over here, the black family was systematically destroyed in slavery. However, Herbert Gutman wrote a book, it was on studies, 900 pages, please go take a look at it. He demonstrates that black marriage rates, this idea that slavery destroyed the black family, isn't accurate. That after slavery, a generation after slavery, black marriage rates were in some instances higher than white marriage rates. After slavery, when slaves were freed, they walked the slave routes to try to reconcile their families together. The black criminality rate in the early 20th century wasn't where it is today. So again, these types of social problems, I know that they have an element of rooted in history that had, for whatever reason, it missed that generation, two or three generations after slavery, and presented themselves en masse in the 1960s. So if it's part of slavery, how did it jump 65 years from the end of the 19th century to the mid-20th century?
What did the New Deal policies do?
Broke
What did the
up-
regulations of the New Deal?
They broke up the black family.
Okay. And that was that.
let's ask questions.
So unfortunately, I wasn't able to see the majority of your argument tonight. I wish I could. It seems really interesting. And so I guess what I'm asking you to do is expand upon an area of your argument. I want you to push back on me when I make a counterpoint. And so you suggested that you would like government out of the lives of more Black Americans. And so I'm assuming that, okay, so you're a free market enthusiast, so am I. And so, but here's my concern. I'm not a free market enthusiast, I think, to the degree to which you are. You know, as much as I like Milton Friedman, I still think he's wrong on a lot of issues. And so here's the caveat I want to kind of present to you. I want you to push back on me because the issue that I have is that you don't want government involved, and so I assumed in the remedy is a greater free market. But government being involved in the social sphere of American life has helped mitigate racial disparities quite a bit. And so you're talking about racial disparities and whether or not discrimination or systemic racism is adjusted or really the reason why those exist. But ultimately, how do you account for mitigating racial disparities in a market that is so free that doesn't allow for government intervention? And I was going to say, you know, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VII, there's the clause that doesn't allow for racial discrimination in the private sector of employment. That helps tremendously access to a free market for Black Americans. Without it, without that government interaction to the market, Black Americans aren't able to get the economic prosperity that you're describing. And another counter thing I want to make is
partially.
hold on real quick, give me one more second. Your argument about marriage is correct. Getting married is one of the best things you can do fiscally. But one of the reasons why getting married in America is so economically advantageous is because the government gives you tax incentives to do so. The government is involved in this economic prosperity of being married. So if the government is taken out of the institution of marriage, you're not allowed to give tax incentives that are given by marriage via the government, then how do Black Americans do better because they're getting married? How does any American do better getting married economically if the government's not involved in this particular social action? So I need you to give me a better argument as to why government interaction is so bad for Black Americans when I would argue that not necessarily affirmative action to the degree you're speaking of in the case examples that exist in education, but the times the government has stepped in marketplace interactions has really helped Black Americans become more economically prosperous, which I think we both agree is a good thing.
My overall position is that I want as little government as possible. When people hear that, they think I'm saying no government. I'm not saying no government at all. I'm saying minimal influence of government is possible. I agree it opened up the marketplace in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but if you look at the statistics, Blacks were actually overcoming poverty, I think it's slightly over 10 years prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act on their own merits, before that act was implemented. So you start to see the market starting to work itself anyway.
See, I don't like the neoliberal market argument though, because no matter what you do, there's plenty of Supreme Court cases that have protected Black American entrepreneurs, and it wasn't just in the neoliberal market.
I didn't say no government. I just said limited government.
Limited government.
Limited government.
So you really think limited government would put Black Americans in the position they are today compared to a completely, practically free market? I'm assuming, but what type of free market are you talking about? What is your conception of free market?
Let's finish this.
That's a little bit.
That's a long conversation. But I will say this, to your point, I think two of the areas in which Blacks have been the most successful is in sports and entertainment. And I find the corollary that there's little government involved in both of those avenues possible. So what does that tell you? Blacks have the capability of being successful when there isn't any type of obstacle preventing them from depending on themselves and those who are willing to help them, versus simply just having a safety net or ushered into a position without them learning.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Children, I've seen that personally because I worked in a juvenile detention ministry for 24 years and I saw all the problems when there wasn't a dad or a mom involved, so I saw that. But my question has to deal with, so I'm going to kind of explain myself. In 1854, the Republican Party was formed as an abolitionist party. They were trying to abolish slavery, okay? And from my understanding, I understand there was whites and blacks involved in that party. But it seems like our country is getting more and more socialist, communist type of a binge, okay? And so I think we're headed back to slavery. And let me explain what I'm saying. If you look at the 10 planks of communism, 2 of them were that you can't own any personal property. You know, slaves were told back then, but I think this slavery will be for all races, like whites, blacks, Hispanics, everybody. You could, a black person was told, hey, we're going to tell you where to live, and we're going to tell you what to work, where you work. Okay. So with Karl Marx 10 planks of communism, one of them is abolition of private property and land and application of all rents of land to public purpose. So the government basically seizes everybody's property. Okay. And then the government also, and then I'll get to my question. The government says, it says in the 10 planks on the 7th one, it says extension of factory and instruments of production owned by the state and bringing into cultivation of wastelands and improvement of soil generally in accordance with a common plan. So the government's controlling all the means of production, and then there's another one here about controlling agriculture. They control all the jobs, is what I'm saying. So communism to me, and I think we're going that way in a socialist, because a friend of mine called communism the tail on the communist kite, socialism, the tail on the communist kite. So my question is, do you think our country's headed that way? Because I think we are headed that way, in where all races will be enslaved.
I think that there are elements in our society that like that as an alternative to capitalism.
Yeah.
And I think that those who do haven't looked in our own hemispheric backyard and seen what's happening, the logical consequence and conclusion of that type of system. But I don't, and I think that we'll never get to that point, but I think there's a slow creep in that direction. Where that stops, I don't necessarily know. It's up to people who don't want that to make the argument for capitalism. Even if you want government intervention or certain regulations to stop human nature, I get that. But we have to make the case, and I don't know if people who are like the free market, who don't want to see socialism or communism, are making the case as effectively as need be for younger people who are, very, very.
I hope one of the 10 planks of communism was no inheritance. So I hope young people realize that if we go in this direction, their parents' wealth is going to be seized by the government.
It already is.
So they won't get it.
Yeah, it already is.
And in socialism, you also see they want a high progressive tax rate. They want, somebody like Sanders wants to really lower the death, lower the death tax, the amount that somebody can claim for their tax with these high federal taxes.
Increase the rate of taxation.
Yeah, that's my concern for their country, that, hey, we're done with slavery, but are we? Because it seems like it's coming there.
But it's important probably not to make that distinction. I know what you're saying, but that distinction, because it's just different.
Yeah.
It's different.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But I understand what you're saying, but I would be hesitant to.
But you look at
say that.
like Stalin, 10 to 60 million people were killed when they forced this system on Russia. And so it's
Mao killed 65 conservatives.
yeah. So there's a lot of evilness.
Oh, no question about that.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you for all your.